All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're tackling a really significant and, let's be honest, often debated topic, the traditional biblical view on homosexuality. We're going to walk through the specific scriptural arguments that build this theological perspective, pulling everything directly from the source materials that define it. So, everything we're about to discuss, it really all starts right here, with this verse from Genesis. According to the sources we're looking at, this isn't just a line from an old story. It's seen as the divine blueprint for all of human sexuality and marriage, set in stone right at the moment of creation. Now, just so we're all on the same page, our goal here is not to take a side. It's simply to lay out this specific theological framework, step by step, drawing every point from the source materials. We're here to understand the what and the why behind this particular viewpoint. So here's our roadmap. We're going to follow the argument as it builds through 6 key areas. We'll start with God's original design, then move into Old Testament law, take a look at the sin of Sodom, see the New Testament's view, dive into some key Greek words, and wrap it all up with what's presented as a call to a choice. Okay, first up, God's original design. The entire argument presented in the sources kicks off right at the beginning, in the creation story, which is seen as the unchanging model for all of humanity. So in this interpretation, when the text says humans were created male and female, that's seen as completely intentional. It's fundamental. The sources argue that this one flesh union is something uniquely designed for a man and a woman. It points to a kind of complementarity that covers everything from companionship all the way to procreation. And because of that, this model is considered the one and only sacred context for sexual intimacy. All right, so from that big picture design, the argument then zooms in on some really specific laws, especially in the book of Leviticus. This is where we shift from a general blueprint to a very explicit prohibition. And here it is. This verse from Leviticus is one of the most direct statements you'll find on this subject in the entire Bible. The language is pretty unmistakable, right? But the sources put a ton of weight not just on the command itself, but on that very last word used to describe the act. That word is abomination, or toevah in Hebrew, and this is where the sources make a really key linguistic point. They note that while a plural form of this word gets used for all sorts of pagan practices, the singular form is used right here. So what's the argument? They say this singles out the act itself as inherently repulsive to God, completely separate from any other cultural context. And this leads to a huge point of debate. A common counterargument is that these laws were only about forbidding pagan ritual sex. But the sources we're looking at push back hard on that. They say, hey, look at the text. There's no mention of temples or idols or cultic prostitution here. So for them, the conclusion is clear. It has to be understood as a broad moral command against the act itself in any and every context. From law, we pivot to a story. The story of Sodom in Genesis is, infamous. But what exactly was the sin of Sodom? Well, that's a major point of debate, and the sources analyze this story in incredible detail to support their interpretation. The whole debate over this story really boils down to one question. Was Sodom's main sin being horrible hosts, or was it about sexual perversion? The sources argue it's actually both, but that the narrative's primary focus is absolutely on the sexual transgression. Let's break this down. The argument for inhospitality often points to the prophet Ezekiel, who lists pride and neglecting the poor as Sodom's sins. But the sources counter with a whole pile of other evidence. They highlight that the men of the city demanded to know the visitors, and that Hebrew verb yada is almost always used for sexual intercourse in Genesis. Plus, Lot's shocking offer of his daughters makes zero sense if the demand wasn't sexual. And on top of all that, other parts of the Bible, in Jude and even later in Ezekiel, explicitly link Sodom to abomination and sexual immorality. So the argument then carries forward, right, into the New Testament. Here, the focus lands on the most detailed passage on this topic, which comes from the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans. According to this theological view, Paul isn't just listing a behavior. He's actually diagnosing its root cause. The argument is that when people turn away from God, when they start worshiping created things instead of the Creator, it leads to a fundamental distortion of God's created order in our relationships and desires. And you can see the step-by-step logic the sources find in this passage. It all begins with idolatry. The consequence, it says, is that God gave them up to passions that are described as contrary to nature. Now, what does nature mean here? In this view, it points right back to that created order from Genesis. So the act itself is seen as a physical symptom of that deeper spiritual error of turning away from the Creator's design. Now we're going to get into some very specific language. The interpretation of two Greek words that Paul uses is absolutely central to this whole discussion. And the sources argue that where those words come from is the key to understanding what they mean.
To get Paul's meaning, the sources say we have to go back to the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint. This is the version Paul would have been reading. And check out the two highlighted words in the Greek translation of that Leviticus law: arsenos, meaning male, and koitain, meaning bed or to lie with. Keep those in mind. So this leads to a really fascinating claim from the sources, that the Apostle Paul basically invented a new word. The theory is that he took those two Greek words directly from the Leviticus prohibition, arsen and koitai, and he smashed them together to create this new word, arsenokoitai. Its literal meaning is male betters, which the sources see as an unmistakable, deliberate reference back to that Old Testament law. But he doesn't stop there. In his list of behaviors in 1 Corinthians, Paul includes arsenokoitai right next to another word, malakoi, which translates as the soft ones. In that culture, this was understood to mean the passive partner in a male same-sex relationship. By listing both of them, the sources argue, Paul is making a comprehensive condemnation of the act itself, covering both the active and the passive roles. And that brings us to the final section of this theological framework. This is where we move from prohibition and definition to the consequences and a call for redemption. According to the sources, the context of this verse is absolutely key. The practice isn't singled out. It's included in a long list of other behaviors, like greed, idolatry, and theft, that are all presented as being incompatible with the kingdom of God. And this is the verse that the sources say is absolutely vital. Right after that long, heavy list of prohibitions, Paul writes, "And such were some of you." The past tense there is everything. He's presenting a message of hope, arguing that through faith, anybody, no matter what their past looks like, can be washed, sanctified, and justified. In other words, they can be made completely new. And that brings us to the ultimate takeaway from this whole perspective. The argument concludes that while the act is defined as a sin, it's considered one sin among many. And just like every other sin mentioned in that passage, it falls under the exact same promise of forgiveness and transformation that's available to everyone through faith. So we end with this question, which really sits at the heart of the entire modern debate. In a culture where our understanding of identity and relationships is constantly changing, what does it mean for a community to ground its ethics in an ancient fixed text? That tension is exactly what continues to fuel this really profound conversation.